Welcome to the Muscle Activation Techniques podcast, trusted over decades to relieve pain and restore mobility by top pro athletes. Our revolutionary technique is a game changer for patient and practitioner.
What was it that you kind of fall in love with or fall in like with enough that you were inspired and enjoyed that? Or was it the fact that you were kind of excited about learning about the human body? Was it the investigation? Was it understanding A plus B equals C kind of thing? What was?
Yeah, a combination of all of that, and the investigation is a key. I think get very analytical when it comes to looking at the body and performance, but because I had my own personal injuries, I was trying to figure out, like, literally what's wrong with me. Mm-hmm. And after the fractured vertebrae, due to compensatory mechanisms, by the time I was 25 years old, I had patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis, SI joint dysfunction. I literally had one injury after another. And I was literally saying, if I'm this bad at 25, what am I going to be like when I'm 50? And so it became my quest to start to understand more about the muscle system's role in chronic pain and injury. When I was a strength coach at Fresno State, if guys were injured, they went to the training room, and when they were healthy, then they could come back to the strength and conditioning room. And so there was no real correlation between the strength coaches and the athletic trainers. And I know that's changed a lot over the years, where there's a lot more of a blend between the two. But that was what I started looking more into because for my own selfish reasons. Because I would see guys that would come in, and most of the guys you set up at that level on college athletes, you set them up on strength and conditioning programs, and they get bigger, faster, and stronger. And one of the things I've always said is you can do anything wrong with athletes and still have success with athletes. But when the integrity of the neuromuscular system starts to decline, i.e. after injuries, you start to see guys that become more injury prone. And I was one of those guys, like I said, after a fractured vertebrae. a fracture heals in 6 to 8 weeks, but years later, I was still having residual problems. And so I was, literally like, what's wrong with me? And trying to figure out why I was so injury prone and like almost a training room's nightmare. Well, when I was the strength coach at Fresno State, I would see guys like that too, where most guys got bigger, faster, stronger. But there were other guys that they just always seemed to be injured. And I think the mentality of the strength coaches and the trainers were, they're kind of a prima donna or wimpy or whatever, and they discarded them. And where I was actually, I needed to find out more what was going on with them. And when I started realizing that it usually after an injury, the body would start to compensate for their injuries, and then it would lead to increased stress on other joints and tissues, and it just would open up Pandora's box.
Are you interested in adding MAT to your practice or having it be your dedicated career? Go over to muscleactivation.com/education to see our class offerings. You can learn MAT in a variety of ways: individual modules, a certificate program, and we now even have an associate's and bachelor's program. Yes, that's right, MAT is now its own college program. Our degree programs have financial aid available for those who qualify.
And so that got me the combination of getting my master's degree and starting to understand the physiology and of the body, that combined with my own injury, it just led me down the path that I wanted to understand the muscle system's role in chronic pain and injury. Because even though I had a fractured vertebrae, and like I said, the fracture should heal after 8 weeks, that I was still having residual problems later. And when I couldn't stand up or couldn't bend over to touch my toes, and it hurt so bad, I felt like this didn't feel like it was the structure that was my problem. It felt like it was muscular. And one of the biggest keys that I noticed after the initial injury was how much I tightened up. And like I became so tight and so hypersensitive through my muscular system that it's like I wasn't like this before. And so there was something muscular that I started to recognize that it seemed like all my adaptations were more about the muscle system adapting as opposed to the problem being originating from the structure.
Mm-hmm. So you leave Fresno State in '88 to go into business yourself, correct? Is that it?
Yes.
And you built a. So what inspired you? I'm going to circle back to your how you got more investigative around the body, but I'm just curious what inspires you to now go into business instead of stay as a strength coach in an institution for a long time.
Yeah, I love the field of strength and conditioning, but I wasn't a group oriented. I wasn't the coach, the rah-rah type guy. It was a coach. The head strength coach at Fresno State, they called him Sergeant Rock. I mean, he was a military hardcore guy, and I didn't have that personality. I guess I'd say that way. I might have been too soft. Like I would let guys get away with stuff. Like I wasn't a disciplinarian when it came to group instruction. And I found that, especially because I was seeking out or identifying with some of the athletes that had injuries, I was finding that I felt like I was good at what I did, but I felt like I was better in one-on-one situations than I was in the group setting. And so I started doing more work in the training side of it. And this is in the 80s, and personal training was in its infancy back then. And I remember one time somebody asked me if they could, pay me to set them up on a strength and conditioning program with my history as a strength coach. And I'm like, you're going to pay me to do this? Like, I didn't know that was a field. And so I actually started doing training and started focusing on people with injuries and pain and injuries and looking at the muscle system's role. So I had a unique niche. I started working at a tennis club, and I had a unique niche working with people that had, little aches and pains and setting them up on their strength and conditioning programs. And I seemed to, I kind of threw myself into it. And then the more I learned, the more I realized I didn't know and that I had to learn. And so I started seeking out specialists in all fields, from chiropractic to physical therapy to podiatry to massage, and sought out specialists in every field of these practitioners that actually understood biomechanics, the interrelationships of joints. And I'll say that because actually one of the early jobs right after leaving Fresno State was working with a physical therapy group that did some work with the Fresno State sports. But one of the physical therapists, his name was Richard Jackson, and he taught classes across the country on pelvic girdle malalignments and spinal issues. And so he taught to therapists, but he took a pretty thorough biomechanical approach and showed how basically the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip, the trunk, and everything all the way up to the occiput is interrelated. And while I worked for him, I was able to go to his courses and learn from his physical therapy background. That's me coming from an exercise science standpoint. I had a unique opportunity to learn from someone in that field. And it was interesting is when I worked with him at the office, one day my back was bothering me, and he did an assessment on me, and he ended up mobilizing my big toe. And he told me my first MTP joint that was locked up. I had limited motion in my MTP joint. He mobilized my big toe and increased the motion in my MTP joint, and my back pain was gone for the day. And I was like, how did he mobilizing my big toe have anything to do with my back pain? It was temporary, but it showed me that was the first thing that taught me about the interrelationships of joints and made me look at the body from a biomechanical standpoint.
Are you experiencing muscle dysfunction which may be leading to pain or inhibited performance in your sport? Or are you just tired of the aches and pains that relate to the normal aging process? If so, go see an MAT specialist in your area. Go to muscleactivation.com/find a specialist.
And from that, I expanded off of that and sought out specialists, and another physical therapist named Gary Gray, who literally I would always say is the king of functional movement. Functional movement now is a buzzword in the exercise industry, but exercise and rehab industry, but the same thing. This is 30 years ago, and he was the pioneer in the functional movement standpoint. And it was great to learn from him because he also had that same mentality that, I mean, it's an integrated system. And I mean, the foot's the first thing that hits the ground. The rest of the body has to react to what the foot does. And it's all this integrated, the integrated system has to work together. And now it fits probably more in the myofascial side of it, in that field. But I think coming from it back then, he was the king of functional movement. And so I got to learn from him, combined with Richard Jackson, the other physical therapist that I worked with, and realized that this understanding of biomechanics was a key to understanding human function. And so I continued to go to courses with other specialists in every field and sought out the people that had a background in biomechanics. Mm-hmm. And I'd probably say the one thing that I learned, I did a lot of work with the functional movement screening and functional training that I learned with Gary Gray, and was able to tie in some of the techniques that I learned from Richard Jackson in order to increase joint motion through spinal and pelvic girdle mobilizations. And I was tying everything together and tying it into the exercise world. Because I was still a strength and conditioning person, so I'm bringing in these principles, but tying it into exercise. So I developed this whole process of analysis and assessment of biomechanics, and then I would identify where I saw my clients' issues and set up stretching and strengthening programs to help resolve their physical issues. And
do you think that there's, I want to just pause you for 1 second. I'll come back to that, but I'm interested if you've ever thought about this, but you mentioned your family, everybody were engineers, and your father was an engineer. Curious if you think that, because in reading all this stuff about your bio and then listening to you, like there's obviously this part of you that's, because a lot of people will go and learn techniques and then just use them. And you've got this kind of, well, I want to figure out how to use it, but then play with it and find something else about it. Where does that come from? Do you think it comes from that genetic sort of disposition to the engineering background and everything? Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, and that's what I've kind of identified as the years have gone on, is I did end up going down the path of engineering, but not knowing it. Kind of blindly went through it, which is biomechanics. The biomechanics of movement, and gaining an understanding of the mechanics of movement and tying it into total body function. There's no question that that kind of originated from the background that my family, from the genetic side of it, I guess you'd say.
Mm-hmm. That's really cool.
But it wasn't as straightforward of a path as everyone else took.
We promise to stay in our lane, and our lane is treating muscle dysfunction with a narrow scope on contractile efficiency. We are not competition to physical therapy, chiropractic, massage therapy, athletic training, strength training, etc. We are an adjunct to physical therapy, chiropractic, massage therapy, athletic training, personal training, strength and conditioning.
You're kind of talking about the 90s in some sense. In the 90s, there's this, call it a confluence of these practitioners. You mentioned some in your things like Paul Chek and Gary Gray, and there's Gray Cook, and there's Mark Leahy, and all these different people are doing some really neat things out there. And you're kind of obviously cultivating your practice. And are you aware of at that time, or is it more kind of, I look back at how you were in the kind of the right place at the right time for this kind of wave of, call it more holistic work and looking at the body differently and stuff? And are you aware of it when you're in it? And if not, sort of, have you looked back on that time and kind of looked at how influential that period has been to how people take care of the human body now?
Again, like I said, even with the personal training side of it, it was in its infancy. Like only Hollywood people, hired personal trainers. And so there's no question, as I looked, I didn't know it at the time. I was just, blind with my direction. I had no business plan in what I was going to do. And it just kept evolving. And the opportunities that I've had over the years, there's no question that, it was laid out, kind of preconceived without my knowledge or choice. And just the opportunity, getting the job, having the fractured vertebrae first off, off, sent me down a path where I mean, for selfish reasons, I was trying to figure things out relative to human function because I was in chronic pain and literally worried about what am I going to be like when I'm 50. And then it led me into the strength and conditioning side at Fresno State, but the connections that I made while I was at Fresno State tied me in with the team doctors and the therapists that actually worked outside of the organization or the university, and that opened up doors for me. And then to have the opportunity to work at with Richard Jackson and Bud Ferrante, they were partners, and that eventually got bought out by Health South. Opened the door to a direction that I never knew I was going to go down, and then to seek out and I find Gary Gray. He at the time that I went to his courses, he wasn't allowing non-physical therapists in his classes, but he let me in his class, and I kind of partnered up with one of his athletic trainers that worked for him, and we did some work together. And so as I look back, I like all of the opportunities. I mean, to learn from two top physical therapists that were out there, and I mean, carving out a new field and being the pioneers in the rehabilitation industry. How did I get those opportunities? I think I would say that. And then probably the next phase is I developed a successful career with what I was doing, being this range of motion / function guy, or exercise / range of motion functional movement specialist. I got hired by the Utah Jazz, and I actually met John Stockton at a wedding. I was in a wedding, a friend of mine that played for the 49ers ended up marrying John Stockton's wife's sister, and that opened up a whole nother door. The night of the wedding, midnight, the night of the wedding, I'm evaluating John Stockton on a pool table at his grandparents or his parents' in-laws' house. And next thing you know, I got hired by the Utah Jazz. And John opened the door to get me by the Utah Jazz. So again, things just kept happening, and I was pretty fortunate in the opportunities that were being brought to me.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We'll post the show notes to this episode on our website. If you found interest in this podcast, please hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to rate and review, and be sure to leave your comments and questions below. Also, check out our Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram channels, where we highlight various muscle activation techniques principles, as well as client and practitioner success stories.